Okay, where are we this time?
I don't know. I thought that portal was the right one.
No, you're just in the tech support.
What? Who said that?
Me. I'm technical difficulties.
Are you serious?
Do you want to get out of here?
Sorry, it's just been a long day.
That's alright. Look, let me just get this fixed and we can put you back on the physical plane.
Physical plane? You mean like Sonic Frontiers?
Yeah, I've been playing it ever since I got it last year, just to pass the time. What do you think of it?
Let's just say my thoughts are a bit complicated. Hello everyone, this is the Eliminator speaking, and today we are going to be talking about Sonic Frontiers, a game that I find is very mixed, not only in audience reception, but in my own perceptions of things, as I feel there are things that they could have done better, but also things that are quite refreshing for the Sonic series. And today we are going to see some of those reasons and more. Now, I don't know all that much about the game's development, aside from the fact that it started development almost immediately after the release of the previous mainline game, Sonic Forces. While Sonic Forces had sold well, it didn't garner a lot of positive reception from the public. So, Sonic Team decided to take that criticism and apply it when making their next game. Though personally, I don't think anyone was prepared for how ambitious this game was going to be. Even I wasn't sure they'd be able to effectively pull it off, due to how many times I had given Sonic the benefit of the doubt, only to be disappointed. But Sonic Frontiers pulled through despite that. And now, with all the DLC released and talk around the game dying down, I decided to look back at the base game with unbiased eyes, to see if it really holds up. So, let's get started. Now, since Sonic Frontiers is a video game, I'm going to dedicate a small section to talking about the gameplay. However, that doesn't mean it's going to distract from anything else that you would normally see in one of my videos, as I find that Sonic Frontiers' gameplay actually does a good job of factoring into the characters and the story, building upon the various elements of a Sonic game and taking them for its own use here. For example, Sonic usually has to get to the end of a stage as fast as he can. However, since you are on islands this time that are very open in landscape, except for you, you'll often be experimenting with the different paths you can take in order to get from one place to another, and thus learn how to increase your speed. Not to mention that Sonic himself is actually upgradable. Now, while Sonic's upgrade system definitely leans more into combat, there's definitely something to be said about speed and mobility, as they make the fights with the various inhabitants of the islands, as well as the bosses themselves, a lot easier. And for example, I'll be fighting an enemy with very good reflexes, and so I'll need to use my more evasive or defensive maneuvers that, or the enemy I'm fighting requires me to do the side loop first. You see, each enemy requires a different set of tactics, so you aren't just spamming the attack button. That, or you have to actually create an opening in order to do so. Another example of this would be that some of the enemies actually require you to hit them in a specific spot before you can attack, and even then, they'll probably regain composure before you can drain their health. While there might not be a cap on what you can do to the enemies, again, they still make it so that the enemies themselves really test you with the game's mechanics. Another example of this would be the boss fights in the game. 2 of the 3 bosses require you to create an opening before you can properly attack the boss, and while you're fighting each boss, you'll have all the moves at your disposal. However, certain moves will be more effective at taking them out faster than other moves, and so you get to experiment with which ones work, especially if you die. Though, compared to the standard enemies on the island, I feel the bosses don't do as good of a job at this. But before I can actually talk about what I dislike about these boss fights, I think it's important that we see how the boss fights themselves work to get a good idea of what bothers me. So, as I mentioned before, in Sonic Frontiers, you're roaming around these various islands. However, early on in your playthrough of each one, you'll encounter one of the Titans, which are the game's bosses, and these things are massive in size. As a result, he actually needs to get all 7 Chaos Emeralds to turn into Super Sonic in order to fight them. In Sonic Frontiers, there are 4 major bosses that you fight across the 5 islands. They are Giganto, Wyron, Knight, and Supreme. Each boss fight plays out in a unique way, as each boss has different mechanics to it, so it isn't just one building upon the previous one. As I mentioned earlier, 2 of the bosses require you to create an opening before you can attack them, whereas the other 2 allow you to just run up and fight. And if my earlier statements weren't any sort of indication, I prefer the latter of these boss fights. And here's why. When fighting Wyron, Super Sonic has to fly behind him and chase him down, while avoiding his missiles. Specifically, he has to parry them back at Wyron in order to stun him. Afterwards, Wyron will then slash at you, and you have to block each one of those slashes again to knock him off guard. Now in theory, this should be a pretty fun boss fight. The only problem is that there's a lot of automation to the boss fight, and it takes way too long before Wyron attacks. So for example, if you miss one of the parries, you have to start all over again with that phase of the fight until, you get it right. As a result, I feel like the boss fight takes way longer than it should, and it makes it a lot less satisfying. Now Knight is slightly better in this regard because you can actually attack him. Like Wyron, he does move around, but you're in an enclosed space, whereas Wyron flies all over the island with you having to chase him. But Knight moves incredibly fast, so you can only get 1 to 2 hits in. On top of that, there will be points where he blocks with his shield, and you have to attack the shield, causing him to throw it, only for you to catch it and then ride it back. Again, the poor controls in this section really start to show. And again, while this is slightly better than Wyron, you still have to create an opening in order to take Knight out, and that's only for the first half. When you chip half his health down, you have to deal with Knight's shield flying around the place trying to hit you, and you have to parry it back into him. However, you again have to watch out for your angle, because otherwise, if you miss, you have to go through the process and find the shield while also avoiding Knight, which again makes the fight very tedious to go through. Now, Giganto is probably my personal favorite of the 4 bosses, mostly because he's the easiest one to manage. He just stands in the middle of the battlefield and swings at the player as they try to get close to him. Admittedly though, there isn't as much to him, as he's kind of just a bullet sponge. Even in the second half where he starts sprouting lasers, he's not too much of a threat for the player, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, especially seeing how the other bosses played out. Unfortunately, I'd have to say Supreme is the least interesting out of all the bosses. He's kind of a combination of them, but I feel like he's more just Giganto if he wasn't playing around as much. Similar to Wyron, he's able to fly around the stage, but he doesn't fly around nearly as much and there isn't as much automation to it. He only flies around the back half of the fight. Thankfully though, he doesn't move as fast as Knight does, so you're able to get in a few more hits. Though he will do this thing where he swacks at you and then fires a laser with his blaster that knocks you back, and you're forced to catch back up to him, and he'll do this a number of times, which is kind of annoying. Also, like Knight, he will spawn these smaller weapons that will fly around the stage and try to attack you, though you can actually bypass them, and they aren't pivotal to taking him out. Unfortunately though, due to this being the final Titan, it's pretty underwhelming to say the least. That's nothing compared to the actual final boss, the end. Yeah, if you've played Sonic Frontiers, or if you've watched a review of it, you know that with hard mode you actually get a boss fight that's basically just a retread of one of the shooter/hacker mini games from earlier on in like Chaos Island. But if you're playing on normal or easier mode, then it's really just nothing. It's just a set of quick time events where, the end of the game happens. And so that makes it a real disappointment. Until recently. You see, this past year, Sonic Frontiers received a slew of updates, one of which including an entirely new storyline that basically rewrites the ending to the original game. In it, you play as Tails, Amy, and Knuckles searching for the different Chaos Emeralds, and then you play as Sonic to climb a set of trial towers, after which you get a Super Sonic boss fight. The fight starts off pretty much the same, but it's after the fight that I think things get really interesting, because after the boss fight happens, the end decides to come down from space to finish you off itself by plugging its long, thick, purple plug into the back of Supreme's head, thus controlling it. And one thing I like about the end is that it isn't just Supreme 2. Yes, Supreme is a vessel for the literal end of the world, but he doesn't fight as well as he could. As you can see, he can barely stand up. As a result, he mostly just swipes at Sonic and shoots things out of the areas in his back that aren't accompanied by giant arms. Like before, the main goal of the boss fight is to chip away at Supreme's health. However, this time, you actually have to take out the giant cord plugged into his head, because otherwise he'll just heal from all of it. Once you've done that, you take out his gun, which Eggman then uses to create a sort of weapon in order to blast Supreme. And once you've chipped away at his health a second time, you're done. Overall, I'd say Sonic Frontiers' controls work better for general gameplay such as exploration, rather than with the boss fights themselves, as it can range from, oh this is fun, to, I'd like a boss fight with whoever came up with this. Now, back to your regularly scheduled content. Now, much like any Sonic release post-2010, I was really worried with how they would handle the characters in Sonic Frontiers, as every game after 2010 kind of reduced the characters to a single specific trait that would make them identifiable for all the wrong reasons. Granted, this kind of thing did have its roots in the mid-2000s era of Sonic, but the main difference there is that the characters still had other traits to balance them out. On top of that, they took the situations they were in very seriously, whereas the versions of the characters seen in like the 2010s onward don't really do that. And what was especially frustrating was that this wasn't just something only Sonic fans would notice. Anyone who picked up a Sonic game and played the story, having played a previous game from like the 2000s, could see the difference. Funnily enough though, this is actually what makes Sonic's character in Frontiers incredibly refreshing. And not just Sonic, but also Tails, Knuckles, and Amy have been very much overhauled from their previous counterparts in terms of personality. And while I hesitate to put Eggman on this list, I do want to give him a quick mention, as I feel that they took more of what worked for him previously, or ideas that he had previously, and expand upon them here. But to stay on topic, let's start with Amy first. I think Amy was done a lot of justice in this game, like everyone else, and that's mainly due to how she's presented. In previous games, they would really hype up the idea that Amy had a thing for Sonic, and that she, would do anything for him as a result of that. Whereas here, it's clear that Amy still likes Sonic, but she also just cares for people in general and is just a caring person. A good example I can think of to showcase Amy's character is actually in the DLC itself, where she, Knuckles, and Tails have to find the Chaos Emeralds. As Amy continues searching, she starts to become corrupted by the same energy that corrupts Sonic throughout the game, but she actively starts to push through it in order to help find the Chaos Emeralds, really giving a testament to how strong she actually is, and how far she's willing to go for others. Now after that we have Knuckles, and I feel like, compared to Amy, I feel Knuckles suffered less in terms of characterization and more in terms of just how he was treated by the other characters, where he was more the butt of the joke than anything else, which once again Sonic Frontiers fixes. When Sonic first finds Knuckles, he proceeds to tease him as he's already been captured by the mysterious force that sucked Tails and Amy into cyberspace. However, as you progress through the island and collect memory tokens, Sonic and Knuckles really start to have more of a heart-to-heart, and we eventually see Knuckles start to talk about his own insecurities and concerns, which eventually leads to him deciding to really put himself out there. And I mean, I understand this from a character growth perspective, but like Knuckles, you've seen what happens when you leave the Master Emerald alone, and even when you are there, people still try to steal it. But other than that, I think this game really does a good job of capturing Knuckles and Sonic's friendly rivalry. Now, I'd say Tails' problem was that he was more sidelined by the stories. He became more useless without Sonic, and more dependent on him whenever he was around. And Frontiers confronts this. One thing I like is how they bring up everything that's happened to Sonic and the others. They don't retcon Tails' characterization in Lost World or Forces. They address it directly. As a result, Tails decides to strike out on his own and be more independent from Sonic and the others, which I really hope that Sega and Sonic Team commit to in the future entries. Now, onto Eggman. Like I mentioned earlier, I'd say Eggman was the most consistent in terms of characterization, and the problem was more that the other characters just didn't work off of him nearly as well as they used to. However, due to story reasons, Eggman spends most of this game on his own, and instead we get interactions with a new character, Sage. Now, Sage's character isn't much to write home about. She's basically your standard AI character, starting off as like another creation of Dr. Eggman's, before growing to care for him, and in turn making the ultimate sacrifice, at least if you played the standard game. In the DLC, she stays alive at the end and simply just gains a new outlook on life. One thing I find neat about Sage though is that, like I said earlier, she grows to care for Dr. Eggman. This is something that we don't actually see with a lot of Eggman's creations, as they either turn on him or are simply programmed to protect him, where Sage actually gains an understanding and sees him as a father. One other thing I like about Sage is how she starts off as just another annoyance for Sonic to overcome, only to grow and understand him as time goes on, and eventually winds up being the one who saves him at the end. And that finally brings me to Sonic. Out of all the characters in Sonic Frontiers, Sonic was definitely one of the ones who you really had to get right, as he's the player character, and you don't want to be wishing that the player character would stop talking before he's even opened his mouth. As I mentioned before, the problem with Eggman wasn't that he himself was a bad character, but that his characterization just didn't gel with anyone else in the room with him. Whereas here, they recorrected Sonic's personality, and now I feel like it works better. If you remember my Mario movie video, then you'll remember me saying that Mario should have been given a flat arc, where instead of him growing and changing throughout the story, Mario already knows the moral, and rather, he encourages the other characters to grow and change. And I feel this is what they did with Sonic, where instead of Sonic having a big arc, the other characters kind of realize things about themselves. As I already mentioned, he's there as a sort of shoulder for Knuckles to lean on and vent about his insecurities. With Tails, he's there to assure him that he's not a burden, and still supports him even when he wants to be independent. And with Amy, he's there to hear her out when she talks about wanting to share her love with the world. And Sonic does all of this while fighting off the cyber corruption that he gets from sort of taking on the Titans and exploring the islands. More importantly, as a result of these actions, in spite of the great adversity, Sage is encouraged to be a hero herself. With the 2010s writing, you could see why Sonic would be an annoyance to someone like Eggman, but in this game, you can see how he would also be a friend or ally to these characters. Overall, while Sonic himself isn't perfect as a character, his characterization in Frontiers very well might be. Now, let's finally talk about the story. Now, seeing how well the characters were handled in Sonic Frontiers, let's see if the story holds up. Just a side note, this will contain spoilers for Sonic Frontiers, so if you haven't played the game yet, please go and do that. But if you have, or you just don't care, let's begin. In Sonic Frontiers, Tails notices an energy spike from the Chaos Emeralds radiating off of the Starfall Islands, and so him, Amy, and Sonic head off to investigate. However, as they travel, they are sucked into a mysterious portal that leads to cyberspace. After Sonic barely manages to escape, he's told that he needs to tear down the walls between dimensions by destroying the Titans that inhabit each of the islands. And so, with this knowledge in tow, Sonic explores the Starfall Islands in order to find his friends and free them. Though as the story progresses, he starts to learn more about the mysterious force keeping his friends trapped. Now, out of all the elements of Sonic Frontiers that we had little to no knowledge about, I was the least worried about the game's story. As, hot take, I don't think we've ever actually had a bad Sonic story. Like any bad product, I think that the worst Sonic games suffer from poor execution of their ideas, and as a result, that reflects negatively on the story itself. Funnily enough though, as I mentioned earlier, I felt the gameplay was the thing I was skeptical about, as I didn't think Sonic could serve an open world very well. But he actually does a really good job here, as since you're searching for your friends and don't really know where you are, it wouldn't make sense that Sonic would just have to run one way through a linear game level. Instead, he's looking around and, as I mentioned earlier, discovering secrets about the island and learning about the force that has his friends trapped. Yes, you can compare this to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, with how Sonic communes with an ancient species that was wiped out by the main threat, as well as him seeing flashes of the cataclysmic event that wiped the species out. But those small details aside, I'd say this bears a stronger resemblance to Sonic Generations' story, as that story is just another day in the life of Sonic until a mysterious force comes in and takes Sonic's friends to a mysterious dimension. After running through levels reminiscent of previous Sonic stages, Sonic frees each of his friends who give him hints as to what might have taken them away. Give or take a few elements, that's basically Sonic Generations, but let's not focus on that. As I mentioned earlier, one thing I like about Sonic Frontiers is how it plays a lot of its elements straight. Yes, the story is more serious, but it doesn't revel in this fact. Yes, Sonic takes the situation more seriously, but again, he isn't overly melodramatic about it. Yeah, the characters have moments of introspection, but they don't spiral into depression as a result. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this is how you course correct your series. You take a look at the old things that work, and you also take a look at the things that don't, and then you see how they mesh with the new things that you're trying to do. Take Sonic's cyber corruption that I briefly mentioned earlier. Throughout the first half of the game, Sonic defeats each of the Titans, and when he does, he gets a flashback to whatever happened to the previous civilization. However, he also sustains a level of cyber corruption, and in previous games from the 2010s, Sonic would not only brush it off, but it wouldn't really be a big deal to anyone, not even the writers. Whereas here, we are given visible signs that Sonic's health is deteriorating, and in the end, when he gives out, it feels like a sad moment, because, despite Sonic's best efforts, the problem won in the end. If I had one problem with this story though, it would have to be with the Ancients. We know that they came to Sonic's planet after the End destroyed theirs, but we don't know where the End came from. We know that the Ancients used the Chaos Emeralds for different things, including the Titans, but we don't know what the Chaos Emeralds were made from, or how the Ancients knew how to use them. We only know the most basic things, and as a result, the viewer is kinda kept in the dark. But other than that, I'd say that Sonic Frontiers' story is a step in the right direction, even if it's not the best thing in the world. Now, let's wrap up the video. That was way longer than it should have been. Yeah, well, I've never really had to describe Sonic Frontiers gameplay until now.
It's fine. Say, could you hold this?
Oh, sure. What does it do? Whoa, where are we?
Back in your dimension. I couldn't figure out how to open the other end, so I just sent us backwards.
Impressive. Seems like nothing's changed since the last video I made. At least, the last one I made before going through that portal. Whatever it is, I'm just glad to be home. Say, what day is... Oh my god. How long were we in there? At this point, I don't even want to know. Let's just kick back and celebrate Christmas.
Good idea. From the looks of it, we might not be going anywhere anytime soon.
That's fine. You're free to stay if you want. Let's just put up the decorations. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments section. What do you like about Sonic Frontiers? What didn't you like? And how would you have changed certain aspects of the game? Also, as a bonus question, tell me, would you like the next Sonic game to continue with the same sort of gameplay as Frontiers? Would you like to go back to the formula prior to this? Subscribe today to join the A-list, and have a great day. Bye!